So hello and welcome back to Books and Things. This is hopefully going to be the first in a series of videos about underrated classics. As I've mentioned before, I absolutely love classics, especially those from the 19th century. And while classics by their nature tend to be books from the past that we still read today, some classics get a lot more recognition than others, and so today I wanted to talk about some underrated ones. Specifically today I'm going to be talking about lesser known works by well-known authors, so books that you might not have heard of by authors you definitely will have heard of. Before I begin properly, just a little life and channel update. As you can see, there is a different bookshelf behind me this week. This is because I've now moved back into my parents' house in London. My masters is nearly at an end. I've got a week basically to finish off everything I've got to do in my masters, and then in a week's time I'm starting my new job and I'm going to be working for a bookshop, so that's pretty exciting. As I said last week, I'm really behind on tag videos at the moment. However, I really like routine and I don't just want to upload like a month's worth of tag videos, so what I'm going to do for the next few weeks, I'm going to try and upload 2 videos a week. So on Monday there'll be a normal bookish video about whatever I want to talk about, and on Thursday there'll be a tag video. I don't know how long I'm going to be able to keep that up for, because I think 2 videos a week after I've done all the tags will probably get a bit tricky in terms of timing and ideas, but I will try and do it for as long as possible, and I like routine. So there we go, I now have Monday as my normal upload day and Thursday is like my bonus upload day. Anyway, underrated books. So the first book I want to talk about is Lady Susan by Jane Austen. Lady Susan is an epistolary novella that Jane Austen wrote about the same time that she was writing Pride and Prejudice, we think, although it wasn't published until much later on in the 19th century, way after all the rest of her books. It is a novella, so it's not as long as her other books, but it is a completed work. It's often published alongside her shorter and unfinished work, so for example, my copy of Lady Susan also has Sanditon Inn and the Watsons and lots of her juvenilia. Lady Susan is an absolutely incredible, brilliant story. It's very, very different from Jane Austen's other works, partly because of the form, because it's all in letters, and partly because of the heroine. Lady Susan herself is very, very different from Jane Austen's other heroines. She is a woman in her late 30s, she's a widow, she already has a 16-year-old daughter, and she's not very nice. Imagine, if you will, Caroline Bingley from Pride and Prejudice crossed with Mrs. Elton from Emma, crossed with Fanny Dashwood from Sense and Sensibility. She's like an evil, cleverer Mrs. Bennet. It's wonderful. It is very different from Jane Austen's other works, but it is brilliant and funny and wonderful, and I love it so much. And it wouldn't be a Books and Things video if I didn't find some way to talk about Charles Dickens. So next I want to talk about his novel Dombey and Son, which I think is brilliant. Charles Dickens is definitely most famous for Great Expectations and Oliver Twist, but in my mind there are many books of his that deserve more recognition. I love Great Expectations, but I don't really like Oliver Twist that much. It's definitely my least favourite Dickens novel. I'm not that fussed about it at all. I've spoken previously about how much I love Our Mutual Friend, but today I wanted to talk specifically about Dombey and Son. The book revolves around the family of a man called Paul Dombey. Dombey has a son and a daughter, but because he has this business called Dombey and Son, he's obsessed with the idea of his son and heir taking over the business, and he just has no time whatsoever for his daughter, and he just cares nothing for her at all. It's a really interesting and complex exploration of family dynamics and gender roles in the Victorian period, and very interesting if you want to see a slightly more feminist side to Dickens. Next, I wanted to talk about Villette by Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte is absolutely most famous for Jane Eyre, but I personally love Villette and I personally prefer it to Jane Eyre. It is definitely one of my favourite books of all time, definitely in my top 10. It is wonderful. The book follows the life of a young woman called Lucy Snow who moves to France to become a teacher there. It's a brilliant book about loneliness and unrequited love and what it's like to be a foreigner in a place you don't know. And it's got such interesting, fascinating psychological depth to it. Like, there's a section in the middle of the book where, basically from a modern perspective, Lucy Snow has depression, but obviously that wasn't really considered or talked about in that way at that time, so it's fascinating from a modern perspective to read that and see Charlotte Bronte really exploring depression, basically. It's so great. I cannot recommend Villette enough. I love it. Next, I wanted to talk about Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Elizabeth Gaskell is definitely most famous for North and South and Cranford, and while I do prefer North and South ultimately to Wives and Daughters, I also really love this book. It is really beautiful. It focuses on a young woman called Molly Gibson who, after many years without a mother, her father remarries a woman that Molly doesn't really like, and this woman has a daughter of about Molly's age. They sort of become friends, and the book follows their relationship and Molly's relationship with a family who live quite nearby. The book examines family life and family dynamics in a really interesting way, and I think it's a beautiful, moving read, and if you liked North and South, you will probably also like Wives and Daughters. However, I should warn you that it is unfinished. Not very unfinished, because as you can see, it's quite a big book, but Elizabeth Gaskell died while she was just about to write the end of this, so it's missing about like 5 pages from the end. You know exactly what's going to happen, it's very, very clear, but you're just missing like a tiny ending. But it is a really, really lovely book, really brilliant and beautiful, and I really recommend it. Moving a little later into the 19th century, I wanted to talk about something by Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is definitely most famous for his novel A Picture of Dorian Gray, or his play The Importance of Being Earnest, but one of my favourite things by him is his play A Woman of No Importance. I've never seen this performed, I've never even heard of it being performed, but I read it and I think it's absolutely wonderful. Like The Importance of Being Earnest, it is a social drama comedy about polite society in the late 19th century, but unlike The Importance of Being Earnest, it also deals with a lot of very interesting gender issues. The play deals a lot with the way Victorian society perceived certain kinds of women, especially what Victorian society deemed fallen women, and it is a really very interesting examination of that. Next, Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies. Evelyn Waugh is definitely most famous for Brideshead Revisited, but I actually much prefer his earlier work, especially Vile Bodies, which is one of my favourite books of all time. This is a brilliant, brilliant book. However, if you liked Brideshead Revisited, you won't necessarily like Vile Bodies because it's a very, very different writing style. Vile Bodies is much less poetic than Brideshead Revisited, it's much sparser, there's a lot more dialogue, a lot less prose, and it is much less beautiful and more cinematic. However, it is absolutely brilliant. Basically, the book follows the lives, parties and adventures of the Bright Young Things, who are a group of young, wealthy people living in London in the 1920s. It's like a less poetic, less beautiful, more cynical British version of The Great Gatsby, and it is incredible. I mean, what more can you ask for in a book? And last but not least, I wanted to talk about George Orwell's A Road to Wigan Pier. Unlike 1984 and Animal Farm, which he's most famous for, this is a piece of non-fiction. Basically, in 1937, George Orwell was commissioned to go to mining towns in the north of England and write about the conditions of life he saw there. This is the result. It's basically half social documentary, half memoir, part political manifesto, and it's just brilliant. If you're at all interested in the social history of the interwar period, then this, I think, is a must-read. It is very, very interesting, very well written, and just a fascinating book, and needs more recognition. So I think that's about all for now. Please let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books, or if you've read anything else by these authors and what you thought of them. Also let me know if you think of any other underrated classics that you would like to recommend me, because I'm always looking for more classics to read. I'll be back on Thursday with a tag video, and in the meantime, I hope you have a good few days of reading. Look, my mug says, I wish someone would hug me, because the cactus, like the classics, is feeling kinda neglected.